keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.
All right. So we've looked at these two verses 4 and 5 of chapter 23 that talk about what to do with the animals of those who hate you or your enemy. Flip real quick, keep your finger there because we're going right back to Exodus, but flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 for a moment. And let's read what is recorded in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 7 through 11. Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Now, there's a series of rhetorical questions here. What is the obvious answer to that question? Do you think there's anybody in our military that pays their own way? And the answer is no. The government pays for them. In fact, they get a paycheck as well as their equipment and the things that they need to do their jobs. So this is a rhetorical question. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? If you plant and work, plant a garden, your table is going to have food from that garden on it. Who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? Again, these are rhetorical questions. I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does the law also say these things? Now, what's he talking about here when he brings up the law? Listen closely to verse 9. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. Then he asks this question. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher ought to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much to ask if we should reap material things from you? What is Paul writing to Corinth about? What's he talking about in those verses? Verse 11 is clearly him saying that he should expect what? Some payment for his work. If I sow spiritual things for you, if I'm teaching you the gospel, then I should reap material benefit from you. He's arguing for the right for his support. That's what he's arguing for there. That's what that whole section is talking about. All of those questions are, okay, I realize that nobody serves at their own expense. I realize that I know that if you have a garden, you eat the fruit of it. Okay. Then he says, it's also in the law of Moses. And he quotes from the law of Moses that says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. All right. So threshing wheat, there's a couple of different ways that you could, or threshing grain. I'm not going to say because it could have been barley and some other grains, but threshing grain, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. It's either cast against a threshing wall in a barn, or it's trampled, usually by livestock. And what happens is the grain is in the hole, and it's in the head, and it's on the stalk. And when you walk these heavy animals over it, all of that stuff pops out, and the seed separates from the rest. And then you throw it up in the air, and the light chaff and all the other junk flies away in the wind. And what's left is the seed that you're going to use for food. Why would he say you don't muzzle the ox while he's threshing? You don't put something over the ox's mouth so he can't eat from the grain. But then he asks this question, was that law really about the ox? And he said, no, that's not really what that law was about. That law was altogether for us. If you understand that you should feed your ox when he works for you, then you ought to understand that you should feed a man when he works for you. Well, I'm going to go back to these two verses and say the same thing. This isn't just about showing compassion on your enemy's animal. It's about showing compassion on your enemy. The one who benefits from the lost animals being brought back, or the animal that's overburdened not having to be. What happens if the animal continues to struggle under its load? What eventually happens? The animal's injured. More often than not, the animal is injured to the point that it becomes worthless. It stumbles and breaks a leg. What do you do with you have to kill him. Then you lose the benefit of that burden animal. So he's not just saying, look, help the animal out. He's saying help the animal out, and indirectly who you're actually helping is the animal's owner, which is the person who hates you. He's telling us how to treat people by telling us how to treat their possessions. Is there something we can learn from that? And the answer is yes. What about people who are our enemies, who actively hate us, who try to undermine our work? By the way, those people exist inside and outside of local churches. They exist in the world, and they also exist within us. Sometimes the enemy is within. Is that an excuse for me to be any less than honorable in my behavior toward them just because they're being dishonorable to me? And the answer is no. Yes, sir.
Because they may have been mistreated, and once you do something good for them, you treat them like God tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you treat them well, then don't tell them what they're going to do. You change their attitude towards you.
It's entirely possible that they could learn and they could repent. That is certainly one outcome. Another outcome is brought up by the Hebrew writer, who says that by treating them well, you heap burning coals on their head. Right. Even your enemy is made in God's image and deserves the respect that God demands us to show our fellow man. And he would ask, for instance, in 1 John, how can you say you love God whom you hadn't seen and you don't love your brother whom you have seen? Now, your brother may be somebody that you like, or it may be somebody who's your enemy. Kind of like the question with the story of the Good Samaritan, who's your neighbor? Was it the priest or the Levite that turned out to be the neighbor? Well, no. When you hear that story, you say, well, it's a Samaritan that turns out to be the neighbor. That's not the person that the average Jew would think of as being their neighbor. In fact, their Samaritan was more akin to their enemy in their mind. But we have to think differently than that. And that's part of what this law is trying to get us to do. So then he says, you shall not pervert the justice due your needy brother in his dispute. Remember I told you? Verse 3 said, you shall not be partial to the poor. Now verse 6 says, you shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. So you don't decide to do something for someone just because they're needy, if it's not the right and proper thing to do in court. But you also don't turn your back on those and pervert justice to work against them. And by the way, sometimes our court system does that. Our court system today. Sometimes the poor don't get a break. But the rich get all kinds of breaks. And sometimes when the poor has a complaint against the rich, the judgment is in the rich man's favor because of assumptions that are made. And the poor man's justice is perverted. He says, don't do that. Don't let that happen. It can happen. It's easy to happen. It's even easier to happen when I see the other party as being more like me, and I feel completely justified in finding in their favor. And he says you need to be careful. Justice needs to be fair. Justice needs to be just. It's right there in the word. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. The last half of that, I think, is the more important thing. You shall not take a bribe is the instruction. The last half of that talks about the effect of the bribe even upon someone who is clear-sighted. Even if I'm generally a good judge of situations, if I'm getting paid from one party, that can get in the way of me seeing clearly. Even when we're not aware of it. Which is why generally in our court systems, what is supposed to happen? Right. It is supposed to be blind, and one of the ways that we accomplish that is if there's a conflict of interest, is what we call it. If there's a conflict of interest, then you should recuse yourself. One of the questions that any good lawyer asks in voir dire before a jury is set is, do you know any of the parties involved in this case? And if the answer is yes, I'll guarantee you the next thing you're going to hear is, have a nice day, thanks for your service. We do not want people who cannot be clear-eyed and make good, even-handed decisions. And that's what he's talking about here. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I will get, even if it's disguised as a gift rather than a bribe, or a job rather than a bribe, or some other benefit, no matter how it is disguised, the right thing to do is say, nope, I can't participate in that so that I can make a good, even-handed choice. You shall not oppress a stranger is the next thing that he says. Since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so that defines what it means by stranger. You yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. How were they strangers in Egypt? Yeah, they were foreigners. They didn't belong there. They weren't ethnically Egyptian. They weren't nationally Egyptian. It wasn't their nation. They were sojourners in the land, is what it would be called in one place. Here it's called strangers. And so when he says, you shall not oppress a stranger, he's talking about people who are in Israel who are not Israelites. What does the word oppress mean? Then that's the next question we have to answer. He is upset. What does it mean by oppress? In the immediate context, I think it's pretty easy to suggest to you that it means to thwart justice for them. He's just talked about being just and being fair and being clear-eyed in your decision-making. And then the next thing he says is don't oppress strangers either. In other words, This applies to everybody. This applies to your neighbors and to your friends. It applies to the rich. It applies to the poor. It applies to the natural born. It applies to the stranger. Somebody you relate to, someone that you don't relate to. Doesn't matter. You need to be clear-eyed and just and fair in your dealings. We go a long way with making an impression upon people in the world if we are fair and honest in our dealings at all times. That makes us stand out. That makes us different. And that is, for instance, one of the reasons why when it's talking about overseers in one place, it talks about them having a good reputation among all in the community. How do they get such a good reputation? Character like this. This is the kind of character that we ought to all have. It's the reason the laws were being given. These laws are not being given to enumerate all these specific behaviors as much as they were to teach the principle behind the behavior. And so once you take this block from 4 to 9 and you look at everything that's talked about and everybody that's talked about, what you realize is, hey, you know what? I'm supposed to be just and fair to everyone in every circumstance. Now that anybody can apply to their life in any situation they find themselves in. What is the right thing to do? That's the thing I must do. Even when it's hard to do the right thing, and even when it penalizes you for doing the right thing. Anybody ever done the right thing and paid a price for doing the right thing? So we have to kind of try to keep those things in our mind. Right. Now, there's somewhat of what seems to be a shift. I'm not sure that it's as big a shift as we think it is, but he starts talking about sowing and land and all sorts of other things. And so let's read this next couple of verses, and this will break down. This may actually end up taking the rest of our time. But we want to talk about these things again so that we start to see the principles that underlie these instructions. You shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield. But on the 7th year, you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beast of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and with your olive grove. He's going to go on in verse 12, talk about 6 days doing your work. It's a different Sabbath under consideration. These two verses are talking about a specific kind of Sabbath. How long does this Sabbath last? No. Verses 10 and 11 describe a Sabbath that lasts an entire year. For 6 years you plant your crops. For 6 years you tend your vineyards. For 6 years you do these things. And the 7th year, you just let them lie fallow. What does that mean, to let them lie fallow? In case y'all haven't picked up on it, she knows how to say no. What does it mean to let your field lie fallow? You don't do anything. You just let it sit there. And you let nature take its course. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give some information here. And to do it without digging into all the reasons why. I'm just going to give you what I believe the preponderance of the evidence is. The Bible doesn't actually ever say that I can find whether or not this is a nationally observed thing or it is an individually observed thing. What I mean by that is whether it is every 7th year, every field lies fallow in Israel, or I start planting this year, and the 7th year, my field lies fallow, and then I plant again for 6 years, and then it lies fallow. But somebody else may start planting in a different year, and their 7th year would fall different than mine. I think the preponderance of the evidence, when you take everything the Bible teaches about this, is that it was a nationally applied thing, which means that every 7 years, there were no vineyards being addressed, there were no olive orchards being addressed. There was no planting going on. Everything was left to nature when it comes to horticulture for a year. Now, what does that mean? What about that 7th year? What does that mean? If I'm not planting, if I'm not harvesting, what am I also not doing? Well, I'm not working the field. I may be working other things. I may be working the sheep, and I may be dealing with other jobs and other responsibilities. I'm not harvesting food. I start planting again on the 8th year. When's my harvest from that? Nearly a year later. So we're talking about just laying fallow for 1 year. It takes 2 years worth of food off your table. What's that all about? That's what we want to talk about for a moment. Turn over to Leviticus 25. We're going to read verses 2 through 7. There's actually some other verses in this context that deals with this same topic. We're given a little different information from the Leviticus record about this. This is a Sabbath rest for the land. And we're given some information about why and what for and some other things regarding it in these verses. Starting in verse 2 and reading through verse 7, Leviticus 25, it says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath for the Lord." Notice what it says, the land shall keep a Sabbath for the Lord. "For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself." You hear that? You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest. There are going to be plants that come up, and those trees are still going to produce fruit. He says, you don't harvest it. You shall not gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle, and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food." Who got to harvest that food? The poor, the needy, the stranger, and the animals. I didn't get to harvest it. So this text clarifies several things. Number one, he says the land is taking a Sabbath rest. Now that has hearkened back to the fact that God had a Sabbath rest from creation. It harkens back to the weekly Sabbath that they were commanded to observe. In 6 days you shall do your work. On the 7th, you're going to take a Sabbath. He says, just like that, from a land standpoint, you can work it for 6 years, but the 7th year, its own Sabbath. There is a break. Why? Is it because the land needed rest? Is this some kind of agricultural thing? Some people propose that, well, this is an agricultural thing. If you let your fields lie fallow for a year or two and then replant, then you end up with better. That's not what's going on here. Listen to what he says. This is a Sabbath to the Lord. This is a spiritual thing. Now, there are, we're going to call them secondary reasons. I'm not sure that they're secondary at all, but we're going to call them that. We have the Exodus 23:11 passage that shows that what grows naturally during the fallow year is left for the poor and the animals to eat. That was referenced as well in what we just read from Leviticus 25. So there's the provision for the poor aspect of it, but that's not all that it is either. That's only a portion of it, because that would lend people to the conclusion that the poor get to eat once every 7 years. That's not the point. The point is that I need to be disciplined enough to listen to God and not harvest it for myself, so that I trust God's provision. Now, if we go back to the Leviticus 25 passage, if you go a few verses further, down verses 20, 21, and 22, it highlights the fact that the Israelites need to trust God to provide enough in the 6th year to sustain them through the 7th and 8th years. It expressly says that. It says that in the 6th year, their bounty will triple, so that they will have enough for the 6th year, for the 7th year, and for the following year, while they're waiting for that year's crops to come in. They're going to get enough on the 6th year to feed them across the entire break. What does that sound like? Okay, yeah. Any biblical story that immediately comes to mind that sounds anything similar to that? Especially in the book of Exodus. We studied just at this point, probably a couple of months ago.
Wasn't it with the Pharaoh when he did the 7 years?
Okay, that's from Genesis. That is a good observation. That is actually something that my son and I talked about before services as we were talking about these things. You'll remember that it was Joseph, but there was 7 years of bounty and then 7 years of famine. And the idea that he was to store up the extra for the 7 years that got them through the 7 years of famine. Not only did it get Egypt through the 7 years of famine, but who else did it get? Feed. It fed everyone, including the Israelites. That's how they ended up in Egypt, as they went there for food. And Joseph was in charge, and he moved his family to Egypt. All right. Okay.
Because for 490 years, they did not celebrate Jubilee. Violation of God's commandment right here. So that's why 70 years of captivity was to make up for all the Jubilees that they missed.
Okay. Anybody remember the story of the manna? The manna from heaven that fed them? Which they were to gather for how many days?
Was it 3?
6 days, and on the 7th day they were to rest. How were they going to eat that 7th day? On the 6th day you gather twice as much, and it stays good and feeds you for the 7th. It's the same principle. He says, look, at the 6th year, you're going to have such a bountiful crop. You're going to have all the food that you need until the land produces for you again. Now, that does imply a couple of things. First, that implies that they stored and kept that food and didn't just sell it all off and make a bunch of money and then be left with nothing to eat. It also implies they got to trust God.
Amen.
that God is actually going to give them the harvest in the 6th year that will feed them the 7th and 8th years, just like he promised. And that teaches another extremely important lesson. And this one we are going to read back in Leviticus 25, down in verse 23. We're going to read this because seemingly in the context, he's changed discussions. But I'm not sure that the principle changes. Look at 25:23. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently. We'll talk about that another time. This is about land law. And when the Israelites sold a piece of land, it was not in perpetuity. If an Israelite person sold a piece of land, eventually they were going to get that land back. That was in the law. But listen to what he said. It shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. Notice that this is a Sabbath for the land and to the Lord. It reminded them that they didn't own the land in the first place. It was God's. They were dependent on God. Who was out there plowing and planting and harvesting? Well, they were. What might they start thinking? Look at all that we provide for ourselves. By the way, 21st century Americans, very guilty of this mindset. Look at all of this produce and prosperity that we provide for ourselves. He reminded them constantly through several different things, and this was one of them. The land's not yours. The produce is not yours. You are stewards of what I'm doing. And I'm telling you, I will see fit that you have everything that you need in the 6th year. So don't worry about it. The 7th year, you don't touch this, you don't plant, you let it lie fallow. Because it belongs to me. I dictate how it's used and when it's used and whether or not you can use it. And I will provide. The reason, and if we get into this discussion, and at some point we will, I'm actually on more than one occasion have developed a sermon to present that I ended up not presenting based on this principle. But the reason why they couldn't sell the land in perpetuity is because it didn't belong to them. They were stewards of it. And God had given it to specific tribes and families, and it was supposed to be retained by them. He did allow them to sell its use for a time if they needed to make money, but it would always revert back to them through one of a couple of different practices. It didn't belong to them. They were stewards of the land. Feudal Europe understood this as well. They believed that the land belonged to God. They believed that the king was the representative of God. Therefore, the land belonged to the king. The king then dictated and gave out land grants. And the people were tenants on the land. And if you were a good tenant on the land and you were productive, you might get given more land to be responsible for so that you can produce more good. By the way, guess who the crops belong to? The king. And the king would also say, you know what? Mr. Howard, I know I've had you raising barley on this 30 square mile plot of land that I've given you dominion over, and you've got different tenant farmers working under you. And say he's a duke for me, and he's overseeing the use in the development of this land. But I've decided that it's in the best interest of the nation for this no longer to be used for barley. It needs to be used for a different purpose, and you're not the person for that anymore, so you're out, and I'm moving somebody else in to do something different with that land, who's skilled at this new thing. Well, God had those same kind of principles at work in his system as well. That's where they got it from, is reading the Bible. The land belonged to God. And everything is God's, including me, myself. For you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. I am not the master of my own destiny. I'm someone else's property. Yes, sir.
Thankful that the king read God's word.
Yeah, when they acted appropriately. Unfortunately, the kings back then weren't much better than the kings in Israel's day or the kings in our day, who become self-serving and protective of their own interests instead of God's. Leaders should be fiduciaries, not acting on their benefit, but acting on the benefit of those who are their charges. Always, but that's not always the way it works. So when we talk about these laws, listen, it sounds like the subject matter's changed, but really it's not changed at all. He's still talking about us being people who understand our place, understand our relationship to God, understand our relationship to the world, understand our relationship to the other people in the world, and let that be the guiding principle of what we do. Does anyone owe us anything? No. Except what? The honor and respect and behavior that God directs. So you have passages that talk about helping those that are disadvantaged, but we also have passages saying that if people refuse to do what they need to do, that there's a line that you don't continue to give and let them not meet their responsibilities. And then we have the difficult job of doing what? Trying to navigate what our responsibility is in these cases. Always what should be the primary thing is, what would God have me to do? That's the lesson here. What would God have me to do in this case? How would God judge this? Do you recall, we're gonna read in just a little while, not too far. Maybe we've already covered it. Yeah, I guess we did. It was back in probably the latter part of chapter 20. The Sabbath law that was given. You shall do no work on the seventh day. What did that mean? Well, the first test for that is recorded in the Bible, where they got a guy who was out picking up sticks on the Sabbath. They didn't know what to do with him, so they said, well, I talked about this in a sermon just the other night. They said, we're going to hold him in custody until God informs us what we should do. That particular man, God's judgment was that he should be stoned to death because he broke the Sabbath. And that was the penalty that God had laid down for the Sabbath, right? If you break the Sabbath, you die. God says, well, stone him to death. Well, you take that principle, okay, picking up sticks on the Sabbath qualified as work. So let's move forward hundreds and hundreds of years, and you got the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rulers of Israel trying to decide what qualifies as work and what doesn't qualify as work. And you might have heard some of these talked about from time to time. There's a Sabbath day's journey, for instance, that's mentioned in the Bible. You know what a Sabbath day's journey was? It was the length that they would allow you to walk before they considered it actual travel and a breaking of the Sabbath. So there was a certain distance you could go from your home that wasn't breaking the Sabbath, but if you went further than that, then you broke the Sabbath. That was them trying to apply this principle. So Jesus comes along and his disciples are hungry, and it's the Sabbath, and they go out into the fields and they pluck grain. And the question that's immediately asked is, why does your rabbi allow you to break the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath? What's Jesus' response?
About David going for showbread.
Okay, he talks about that. That's good. And then he asks this really poignant question. Was man made for the Sabbath, or was the Sabbath made for man? And the answer is the Sabbath was made for man. Now, what his point was, is what they did wasn't breaking the Sabbath because they needed food. Just like David and his people needed food. And the purpose of that law wasn't to keep people from being able to feed themselves. Picking up sticks is another matter. We have to make some applications of these principles and figure out exactly what they mean for us. And try our very best to honor the purpose of the law that's given by the keeping of the law. You know what we tend to do with laws? We use them to our advantage. When it's in our interest to apply the law, we want to apply it. When it's against our interest to apply the law, what do we want to do? We want to look the other way. That's not what the law is for. By the way, that's not what the civil law is for in our society, and that's not what the law of God is for. What's the purpose of a law? Why did he give the Mosaic law? Why did he give the law of Christ? Why does he have governing authorities that have the right to lay down laws and rules for society? Why is there laws that are given? It is to protect and preserve what is right and what is just and what is honorable and what is good, and to benefit people. That's why laws exist. By the way, are there bad laws that are made by men? Yes. Talk about that. We can talk about how to rectify those situations. But that doesn't negate what we're trying to do here. Another thing that comes to mind, there was a tax. And at one point, they come to the disciples of Jesus and they say, hey, does your rabbi pay the tax? And they're like, well, yeah, sure, of course he does. And then they go to Jesus and say, hey, they came asking about the tax. What are we supposed to do? Anybody remember what Jesus said in that case? That's where he ends up going. He actually tells him to go pull a fish out of the water. Look in the fish's mouth. There was a coin in there. He says, take that to him and it pays your tax and mine. And then he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Saying what? What do I do? Do I pay the tax? Do I not pay the tax? Look, it's their tax. It's their money. They ask for it back, give it back. Behave honorably. Don't get into arguments about whether it's right or wrong or whether it's fair or not fair. I wish I could produce my tax out of the mouth of a fish. Fortunately, I can't. But we have to understand what's being taught in these things. And I'm way over time. That's what happens when the bell ringer's not here. I guess Sean does it a lot of times. He was busy. Joshua does it when he's here. Tell Joshua it's his fault. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes, ma'am.
Answer for studying was, are we allowed to work on Sunday?
There is no prohibition against working on Sunday anywhere in the Bible. So I personally would never, ever, ever condemn anyone for working on Sunday. Now, if someone chose to work on Sunday and never worshiped God, that would indicate other issues. Yes, ma'am. There are some Sabbatarians out there that believe that the Sabbath is still applicable. The Mosaic law was fulfilled by Christ, and we are no longer under that tutor. We are now under Christ, and he has not applied those things to us in the New Testament, and so I have no problem with working on Saturday either. Again, I work every Saturday. It's probably the day I spend the most hours working. But the important thing to recall is this. If I use work as an excuse, which is a God-ordained responsibility that we all have to work, if I use that as an excuse for not doing other things that he has commanded me to do, that's a problem. And Jesus deals with that problem with the case of a person who wasn't paying proper respect to his parents. And they were saying, well, what I gave at the temple, I don't have the money left for my parents. And he said, no, you're not going to use that responsibility as an excuse not to meet this responsibility. So we have to look into those things. All right, real quick, and we're way over time. Next Wednesday is what? December the what? Okay. That way I can get the right date in here. And that means that we will be with a song service next Wednesday. And so it will be the 11th before we have class again. Thanks for everybody's attention and participation. And we're probably going to at least cut the song service short. I'm going to give my son as much time as I can.
But thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.